Welcome to Ethics Matter. I'm Stephanie Tsai. We are talking about artificial intelligence. It is a vast topic that brings up monumental questions about existence, about humanity, but we are going to focus, of course, on the ethics. In fact, some of the world's top scientists have said recent breakthroughs in AI have made some of the moral questions surrounding the research urgent for the human race. For this, we're joined by Wendell Wallach, a bioethicist at Yale University and the author of A Dangerous Master: How to Keep Technology from Slipping Beyond Our Control. Wendell was recently named co-chair of the Council on Technology, Values, and Policy for the World Economic Forum. So Wendell, you are perfect for this discussion. Before we dive into the many hot topics when it comes to AI, I know that the term is sort of an umbrella term that encompasses a lot of different technologies. So will you just give us sort of the beginner's explanation of AI to start us off?
Well, originally artificial intelligence, which was a term coined in the 1950s at a conference at Dartmouth, it largely meant just achieving kind of a human-level intelligence within machines. And the people at that conference thought that that would happen within a decade or so. They were very optimistic. They thought the challenge was relatively easy. It's now become a bit more confusing what the term actually does and doesn't mean, largely because every time a goal is achieved, such as beating a human at chess, the bar gets raised. Somebody says, well, that wasn't really artificial intelligence on the way it beat the human at chess. In this case, it didn't really play the way a human chess player would play. But even the folks in the more advanced fields of artificial intelligence feel today that we are just beginning to have true artificial intelligence, that a lot of what we've done so far is largely automating systems, largely programming them to follow through procedures that humans have thought about in advance.
So that's a great place to start because, in fact, one of the trending hot topics in AI is that Google reached what has been called by some the holy grail of AI. They programmed a computer to beat the best Go player in the world. That was a game that I played with my grandmother when I was a kid. I was never very good at it. It's very complicated. Why was that so significant? Why was it a bigger deal than when the IBM computer beat Kasparov in '97?
It's just that it's a more complicated game and a game that takes more imagination in terms of how you play it, how you execute it. So it had played a European champion, and then months later they had this $1 million challenge with Lee Sedol, who is one of the great Asian players, considered by many to be the greatest player in the world. The program was developed by DeepMind Google. DeepMind Google is a very interesting company in the field of deep learning. Deep learning is this great breakthrough that has opened up this doorway for people to feel that artificial intelligence is finally coming into being. And whereby the term seems to suggest that these computers have very sophisticated learning capabilities. It's really a narrow form of learning that they're engaged in. But what they have been able to do is they've been able to solve some of these problems that have bedeviled computer scientists for decades now. Problems in simple perception. So a deep learning computer can actually label all the objects in a photograph accurately. That was something that had not been done hitherto.
But doesn't a lot of what deep learning involve basically statistical learning? In other words, a sort of number crunching. How much of deep learning involves imagination, involves creativity and adaptation in the way we would define human intelligence?
Well, whether it really involves human intelligence, that's a very different story, but it does involve what are called neural nets, which is a form of computer programming which tries to emulate a little bit what's going on in the brain, or at least a model, a computerized model of what's going on in the brain. So your desktop computer has one central processor that manages all the computations. A neural net can have many different processors. The other thing about a neural net is that it is built in layers, and we don't necessarily know what the computer is doing in those middle layers. So in this case, what deep learning computers are doing, they are analyzing a massive data flow, And they are discovering patterns, many of which humans perhaps don't even know about or can't recognize. And therefore, they are finding new ways of proceeding, or at least understanding some of the existing strategies.
Okay, so starting from that, did that victory of AlphaGo over Lee Sedol, as an ethicist, seeing that victory of machine over human in that context, did that cross a threshold for you that concerns you as an ethicist?
No, this one doesn't. This one doesn't at all. I think it only does in the sense that people get caught up in these human-machine comparisons. The only comparison that really should be made here is that we humans have something that we call winning the game. And yes, AlphaGo, the software program, won the game. It figured out how to play against Lee Sedol. It won 4 games to 1, and in one of the games, it did a move that surprised everyone, that perhaps no human player would have ever seen the connection to that board and that possible move. So that was fascinating. But I actually sat on a panel with Lee Sedol, and one of the things that I noted was, first of all, the computer did not play the game that Lee Sedol was playing. Other than the winning, other than that measurement we make at the end of a game, that this was winning, what the computer was engaged in was very different than what Lee Sedol was engaged in. Secondly, this computer had actually played or studied millions of games of Go. A human being like Lee Sedol, he's maybe played, I don't know, tens of thousands. I don't know exactly how many games he's played. But perhaps what's remarkable is that without all these resources and programmers and teams trying to figure out how to make this machine so smart, that this human was able to win one game. And he believes he could have won more. He thinks there was another game that revealed a flaw in AlphaGo's programming, but he didn't exploit it effectively.
I think the reason why people like that man versus machine, and they talk about it in that way, is because humans are worried about being replaced to some degree by machines. That's already happening, right? According to a study out of Oxford a few years ago, 40% of jobs will be automated by machine learning and mobile robotics.
They actually said 47% of existing American jobs could be replaced, and when their form of analysis was applied to China and India, it was 69% and 75%.
Which is concerning.
Mind-blowing.
Yeah, mind-blowing. By 2034. So that certainly must bring up ethical issues around the people that are creating these machines and adopting these technologies.
Right. This is a very difficult issue. And I mean, it's the long-running concern, the Luddite concern going back 200 years ago, that each new form of technology will rob more jobs than it creates. Up to now, we haven't seen that. Each new technology eventually creates more secondary jobs than it eliminates. But I'm among those who believe that increasing automation is already putting downward pressure on wage growth and job growth. Not only downward pressure, but as we get more and more intelligent machines, we're going to see this rapid pickup. It doesn't take a lot of jobs to be replaced in a year to create a panic mode. But the difficulty is this an artificial intelligence problem, or is this a societal challenge? I actually talked with the president of a company that was building robots that basically take boxes off of racks and move them and put them on trucks. And his concern was that there were millions, perhaps 25 to 100 million or more workers in the world who do this kind of work. On one level, it's inhuman work, but he recognized we're going to take jobs. I looked at it and I said, well, I don't know that this is really his problem. Societies are going to have to adopt technologies that improve productivity, and it's not bad that we're taking away inhuman jobs. On the other hand, we have a major societal challenge here. If wages are no longer the main way in which people get their incomes, have their needs provided, then how will they get those needs provided?
And this is when conversations about universal basic income and that has come up. I guess it also leads to the question of whether, even if we can automate more? And even if we have the capability to replace professionals with machines and with robots, should we?
That's a difficult question. And I think every society has to have that debate. Societies are going to differ on that. Unfortunately, as with most ethical issues, there's not a simple yes and no. There are different values, there are different prioritizations of values. So it becomes an ethical issue in the terms of what are the options and what are the ways of. Ethics is often not about do this or don't do that, but it's if you go down this road, then that has those ramifications, and how are you going to deal with those ramifications? Or if you go down an alternative pathway, then how will you deal with those considerations?
Well, there's such important questions, I think, to be asked, because this technology is happening now. Truck drivers and cab drivers could be some of the workers replaced, and that brings me to the next hot topic in AI, which is self-driving vehicles. Proponents say that self-driving cars could reduce the some 40,000 annual traffic fatalities that we have a year just in this country. So there have been a couple accidents already with these self-driving cars, and they seem to make people so uncomfortable with the technology. It gives us pause. And it must bring up sort of the interesting questions about sort of the value of the individual versus the overall good that may come, right? With self-driving cars. Interesting questions for an ethicist.
Real interesting questions, and they've gotten posed recently in the form of what are sometimes known as trolley car problems.
Explain the trolley car problem.
Well, the trolley car problems have been around since 1967, first proposed by a philosopher, Philippa Foot. But they proliferate into hundreds of different problems, and basically they're a problem where you're asked whether to take an action that could perhaps save 5 lives, but it would cost another life. So traditionally, as you throw a switch that redirects a train to a different track, but one person still dies. Suddenly, these are getting applied to self-driving cars, and questions are being asked, well, what should the self-driving car do if it's going to hit a bunch of children, but it could, rather than hit those children, drive off the bridge and kill you, the passenger in the car?
Right.
There have been recent research done on this. There was some articles in Science magazine in June where generally the public felt that the car should do what would kill the least number of people. On the other hand, most of those people also said they would not buy a car that would kill them or the other occupants. So now, in order to save a few lives, when a once in many trillion time incident occurs, millions of people do not buy self-driving cars, and then we have thousands of losses of lives that would not have occurred otherwise. So it's one of these interesting things where the short-term ethical calculation may actually come into conflict with the long-term ethical calculation. Now, I've made the proposal that there is no right answer to this problem. It's a totally new situation. You need to have many stakeholders sitting down and establish new societal norms. And frankly, I think you don't program the cars to make a decision. Even if we could get them to make a decision.
Even if there was an ethical dial on which you could program the car to reflect your own personal values, you don't think we should have that?
Well, no, that's a possible option. And to be honest, I proposed that a few years ago. But if it's going to discourage people from buying a car, or people are going to be afraid to do anything because they would think that even though I'm not driving the car, am I responsible if I've told the car to kill other people rather than kill me? You know, it sets up a very interesting ethical quandary for the individual who has to make the choice. But my concern is there is, in this case, a utilitarian calculation, meaning the greatest good for the greatest number. But the tension throughout history has been through utilitarian calculations that violate individual rights.
Right.
And so this is would be a real tough thing for a society as a whole to make a decision that maybe we aren't going to make that individual rights decision because in the long run it really has other ramifications.
Individual rights and maybe national rights, because let's talk about another big topic when we talk about AI, which is lethal autonomous weapons. Does that question of the value we place on ourselves or our own our own country versus the greater good, humanity's greater good, does that also play in to a discussion about autonomous weapons?
Certainly. I mean, so there is this movement to ban lethal autonomous weapons, and that basically means any weapon that can select its own targets and kill them, or at least, decide who is the target among groups of people that it's looking at. And there are all kinds of moral goods that come from this. The obvious moral good is it could save some of your soldiers.
Right.
On the other hand, if it saves some of your own soldiers, it could lower barriers to entering new wars. All kinds of aggressive countries will be aggressive if they don't feel like their citizenry is going to rise up against them, because there'll be a lot of soldiers' lives lost. When we invaded Iraq, we had almost no loss of life at all during the invasion itself. But here we are.
In an insurgency
in
which
an insurgency
soldiers' lives
where,
are still being lost, yeah.
And it's concatenated into perhaps as many as 300,000 lives lost in Syria alone. So sometimes you can enter into a conflict because you think there's a moral good, or at least you can save your own soldiers' lives. But if you're lowering the barriers to starting new wars, or if you have machines that could unintentionally start a war, or that you start to have flash wars the way we have flash crashes on Wall Street, because machines suddenly are reacting to each other. My lethal autonomous weapons versus your lethal autonomous weapons in ways that we don't even know what they were responding to. But in that flash war, 1,000 lives were lost. You have some real concerns going on. So a number of us, actually a pretty large community, has begun to support this banned killer robot movement, and the UN has been meeting for 3 years already in Geneva with expert meetings, and those will continue over the next few years to see if it is possible to forge an arms control agreement that many countries would sign on to, that nearly all countries would sign on to ban this kind of weaponry. Now, it does not mean banning advanced artificial intelligence, but it means banning weaponry in which humans are not in the loop of decision making in real time, that they're there when the crucial decision is made, not just that they've delegated a decision to the machine hours or weeks beforehand.
Could I posit that there might be a day in the future where we can program machines to be more moral and ethical than human beings?
There might be.
A day where they're more consistent. Because certainly
well, that's a
human beings don't always act in the interest of humanity and for the greater good.
Well, that's sort of the self-driving car dilemma, in one form, but I'm also known for a book that I co-authored with Colin Allen of Indiana University 8 years ago called Moral Machines: Teaching Robots Right from Wrong. And it looked at precisely this question. It looked at this question of how can we design machines that are sensitive to human values and implement them within the decision processes they engaged in. We were largely looking at it from the perspective of philosophers with a bit of computer science, but suddenly this has become a real challenge for engineers, largely because of these deep learning breakthroughs and these fears being raised about whether we are now going to make advances in artificial intelligence that will eventually have superintelligence. So because of that, some of the leading responsible members of the AI community, particular people like Stuart Russell, have instituted this new approach to building artificial intelligence that they call values alignment. Now, up to now, machines are largely being built to achieve certain goals. And the point here was, no, we don't need to be just looking at building our machines so they will fulfill a goal, because artificial intelligence may actually be able to fulfill its goal in a stupid or dangerous manner, but we need them to be sensitive in the ways in which they fill their goals, the ways in which they take certain actions to human values. So their concern is, how do we implement this within engineering practices, within the very forms of artificial intelligence that will be built? Not only that they implement values, but how do we ensure that they are controllable, that they're safe, that they will be sensitive to the concerns we are.
And maybe this is sort of beyond your purview, but is there a way to make sure that we can continue to control the machines versus them controlling us? I mean, if they reach a level of super intelligence or singularity, as some have called it.
Right. It was called the singularity for many years, and now this term superintelligence has superseded only because the singularity sort of got a little bit confusing. No one knows. And it's not an immediate concern, in spite of the fact that the newspapers put a picture of Arnold Schwarzenegger as a Terminator on every conceivable article where anybody even talks about artificial intelligence. I'm just amazed at how many pages I've shared with him over the years. This is all a very distant prospect, and many of us even question whether it is achievable. But to laud the engineers is they're saying, yes, but by the time we know whether or not it's achievable, it may be too late to address whether it's manageable. So let's start dealing with the control problem, with the values alignment problem now. And I applaud this because it also will be applicable to the near-term challenges.
Right.
People like me who've been talking about near-term challenges with emerging technologies and artificial intelligence in general, we've suddenly been getting a lot of attention over the last year or two. And it's largely because people like Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk and Bill Gates are raising longer-term scare issues around superintelligence. So, it's a two-edged sword.
It's also because of the actual leaps in the technology and the fact we do have self-driving cars, we do have AlphaGo. Elon Musk, who is invested in DeepMind, is one of the signatories to that letter that basically said, let's be careful of the pitfalls of AI, which is encouraging. But
Not
then
only that, he put his money where his mouth is. He gave $10 million to the Future of Life Institute for projects that would work on safe AI in one form, or robust and beneficial AI is kind of the more generous way of putting it. And people like me received grants to move forward some research in those areas. So that speaks to him.
Yeah. What about government's role?
Governments are just beginning to look at these concerns. There have been the White House has held some meetings over the past year where they have been looking at issues around AI and whether there are initiatives that should be taken. Many of the international standard setting boards are looking at whether there are international standards that should be set either in electrical engineering or in other kinds of fields. But this is all very new. On the one hand, it's opened the door for overly zealous ethicists like myself to maybe call for things that aren't fully needed, but may be needed, and we need to give attention to it. On the other hand, there's always a concern that will squirrel innovation, but you don't want to put in place bureaucracies based on laws that look like they're good today, but the technology will make obsolete tomorrow. So I personally have called for the development of global infrastructure to now begin to think about how to ensure that AI and robotics will be truly beneficial. And that infrastructure isn't just hard law and hard governance. If anything, we should limit that, but look more at soft governance, industry standards, professional codes of conduct, insurance policies, all kinds of other mechanisms, but also look at how we can engineer AI more safely. So what are the engineering challenges? How we can make values such as a responsible agent or concern for privacy part of the design process that engineers think through when they implement new technologies. So there is that beginning to think through, well, what really can international bodies do? What can the engineers do? What can industry do? What can be handled in other more adaptive evolutionary mechanisms than the ones we tend to rely upon today in terms of hard law and regulatory agency? We tend to think about those are kind of the first response, but perhaps we need to think through a new, more parsimonious approach to the governance of emerging technologies, where we can certainly penalize wrongdoers, but we don't expect to come up with regulations and laws for any conceivable thing that can go wrong.
Well, and part of that is that there's a potential net benefit to humanity, right? With a lot of the technologies we're talking about. We've been focused on the potential negative effects of AI in this conversation, but there's these net positives in sort of robust AI research that could really benefit us.
Tremendous benefits in healthcare, I mean, we talked about driverless cars. I think that the overall moral good is clear with driverless cars. All of these technologies are being developed because somebody believes that there is some tremendous worldwide good that can derive from their research. The difficulty is, can we maximize those benefits while minimizing the downsides, minimizing the risks? And that's what requires much more attention.
Absolutely fascinating. Wendell, Wallach, thank you so much for joining Ethics
Thank
Matters.
you ever so much. This has been great fun.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.